There's still people coming in. So let's start. Already yesterday, I briefly in my presentation on the updates of the SSPs, I indicated that there are different ways that we can think about SSP updates. And the most fundamental would be to really rethink the overall scheme. But we don't want to do that too often, clearly, because you want some continuity. And we now see that the SSPs are quite successful in literature. The least fundamental might be just to update baseline information and to scale scenarios with it. But that is not really satisfactory. We know that since 2012 or so that we started to develop the SSPs, a lot of things have happened that will also have influence on our long-term outlook. For instance, the pandemic has consequences on the dynamics of population growth. It might also have consequences for our expectations on economic growth. There are things happened also in technology development that will have consequences. And so we feel that this is by now absolutely time, maybe even somewhat too late, to start updating the scenarios. And so we have been contacting the original teams that developed the scenarios, which is the demographic team of the Wittgenstein Center in IASA and the economic team of the OECD, whether they would be interested in updating these scenarios. And they indicated that they were prepared to do so, which is really helpful. And so in this session, we will first of all ask these groups to present the work that they have done and how far they have come in finalizing those data sets. The intent was not to have the final data available today. The intent is to really have some draft results available so that we can share them and also get comments. And then we would like to finalize them in autumn. There are also other presentations today simply related to this theme of demographic projections and economic projections. So at this point of time, actually, I would like to ask Wolfgang Lutz from IASA and from the Wittgenstein Center to take the floor and to start presenting the basic approaches of population scenarios.
Thank you very much. Can you put up the slides? I'm Wolfgang Lutz, and I've been working on population forecasting for the last 40 years or so. And I was invited by the organizers to maybe just step back one step and say, think of some of the choices that we have to make when we do population projections. Some people have also asked what is the difference between the UN projections, our IASA projections, and several other projections. So I just tried to highlight some of the basic choices. The first is, what is the purpose of population scenarios in the study of climate change? So we need to know the number, the distribution, and capabilities of humans, both for the mitigation and the adaptation side. So here you see the full circle. The human population, not just its number, but structured by relevant characteristics. It's us who consume energy. It's us who cause the greenhouse gas emissions, and our changing structure also contributes to the greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also us who develop new green technologies and contributed to mitigation. So this avenue from humans causing climate change has been very well studied, although there are still many open questions. More newer is the focus on how does climate change feedback affect the human population. And here the most important thing is that really we are looking at the climate change at time t plus x, and we should not look at the effect of the population of today at time t. We also need to anticipate the human population of society in time t plus x. So we need to see how the climate of, let's say, 2070 will affect the population of 2070. And for this, we need population scenarios. And here you see just several avenues how climate change impacts on the human livelihood, which again feeds into the migration issue and the health and mortality issue, and also fertility is not unrelated. So this is the main story why we need population scenarios, forecasts for decades into the future, both for the mitigation and the adaptation side. There's a little bit definition of what is demography, because people seem to have different notions. It is defined as the scientific study of changing population size and structures, where structures is stated in the plural. So we are not only looking at age structures, as some people think demographic change is only age structure change. There's a multidimensional approach to demography where we at YASA, over the past 40 years, have really made some contributions. So we look at populations by age, sex, place of residence, education level, labor force participation, ethnicity, or whatever you want to study. And these are the human characteristics that are typically collected in censuses. And here we look at the changing structure. Another thing is demos is a Greek word for population. It is the aggregate. So we look at changes at the aggregate level. But this is this famous Coleman ship that, of course, to understand what's going on at the aggregate level, we need to go down to the micro foundations. So there's this constant interaction between micro and macro conditions leading to micro outcomes, like a birth, which is then aggregated up to the macro level outcome of the fertility rate. It was already quite some time ago, more than 2 decades ago, that we published a special issue of Population and Development Review called Frontiers of Population Forecasting, where we really identified some of the basic choices to be made. The first is the model, like what dimensionality do we want? Throughout scientific history, as long as people did population projections up until about World War II, they only applied a growth rate to total population size. So this is what still is done today in animal demography. That's also a big discipline, not considering the age structure. And in that sense, population is only a scaling factor. Like in the threat scenarios, you also only had population size in order to calculate GDP per capita or other indicators per person. And then the conventional so-called cohort component model that was already developed in the late 19th century, but it was only applied to the world population and increasingly to individual countries after World War II. That looks at the age and sex structure. That is still what today most national statistical offices do and what the UN population projections offer. And then there is the multidimensional model, which in addition to age and sex also looks to level of education, labor force participation. Like with the Joint Research Center we recently did, this such a 4-dimensional population scenario for all EU countries, and that includes labor force participation in addition to education and sex and age. And then, of course, the rural-urban place of residence. You can also do it by health status or others. Now, when choosing what model we want to have, there is also important to distinguish between two quite different purposes for explicitly considering this population heterogeneity. The first is to make the projections of population size more accurate by accounting for heterogeneity. There's a lot of literature. If you have hidden heterogeneity in the system, the outcome is different than when you have a homogeneous population. So it makes the population projections of size themselves better, so to say. And the second, probably more relevant, is that also the dimensions that we explicitly incorporate are of interest in their own right. Like if we don't have it by level of education, we will never have the average education of the population. So if we're interested in the effect of education on health and all other things, we need to take them explicitly into account. The same with place of residence. So sometimes people argue only on the first and sometimes only on the second. I think these are two valid but independent considerations. Now, the final point is really how to deal with uncertainty and feedbacks from the rest of the world. What is usually still done, most national statistical agencies do this independent, autonomous projections, assume that the future changes, whatever happens in the world, do not affect population trajectories. It's sort of endogenously driven. And that's pretty much the UN probabilistic population projection model, where sort of the time series of the countries in the world from 1950 to 2015 pretty much define in a complex Bayesian statistical model what will happen in the future with given uncertainty ranges. The second is that we invite experts to either in a probabilistic or in a deterministic way make science-based arguments based on the state of our knowledge of the literature about the determinants of future fertility and mortality. So this has been more our YASA tradition of explicitly asking experts, but not just for their opinion, but for reasoned arguments. And then there is a final way of possibly doing it that was not yet very successful, fully integrated models where you have a sort of a fertility function. The Club of Rome, the Limits to Growth, the World 3 model there 50 years ago, did this, for instance, where fertility was directly a function of income per capita. Now they projected a big crash, actually for right now, the early 20s, and as a consequence, when income goes down, fertility goes up again, which is, of course, against all the knowledge we have about the irreversibility of the demographic transition and so on. But there is at least an attempt to have a fully integrated model. So here you also have these three levels of seeing it independent or fully integrated, and finally, how to come up with the assumptions. Again, here you have a spectrum of sort of 6 different ways of dealing it. On the one extreme, you have blind statistical extrapolation. Essentially, just put a ruler on the trend of fertility trends. This happens. I mean, you may have seen in 2012, the Club of Rome published an update which essentially did this to fertility forecasting. Then we have the more sophisticated statistical extrapolation. That's, for instance, what the UN does now, having a relatively complex expert-informed model, but still apply it only to the past data. And then if we go to the other extreme now, jump over there, we have expert opinions without justification. That is what Delphi studies do. Just ask you, tell me what you think is going to be the fertility, and you just give a number, and that's it. If you, sort of in a more reasonable way, that's what we try to do at the other before, is expert argument-based assumptions. So the expert has to justify their assumptions. And then you can go further up, as we did it most recently. That's what the SSPs now have in this, defined in 2014 in this 1,000-page Oxford University Press volume, blending some statistical extrapolation with country-specific expert knowledge. I think I'll stop here. I just show you that you have to make choices on all these different dimensions that I showed you. And if we think what the SSPs of the future should look like, whether we should now, for instance, incorporate the rural-urban dimension into the age, sex, and education projections, or do any other reform improvement of our model, we have to keep these choices in mind. Thank you.
You can stay here for a while if there are still questions that people would like to ask. So any things that you would like to have new into the demographic projections that you might want to consider?
Thank you for the very comprehensive and very... Wolfgang, thank you for everything and what you said. And a question for you is that on the uncertainty, is there any way for the uncertainty? Is there any way we incorporate the probabilistic projection into the defining SSP space?
Yeah, as I said, there are two ways of dealing with probability. The one is that the uncertainty intervals be defined by the statistical model. That's like the UN uncertainty interval count. Or the other is to have expert-defined uncertainty ranges, like we had with our first probabilistic population projections, that we ask the experts, like, define us, let's say, what is the upper and lower limit of the 80% interval for future fertility for a specific country, and then the probability assessment is subjective probability is given by the experts. There is problems with both, and the problem with probabilistic population projections generally is that the users are rather helpless what to do with them. I mean, that's also essentially no national statistical office, or very few ones for experimental purposes, pick up probabilistic population projections. Because policy scenarios show, like, this is what will happen if you do nothing. If you have this policy, then you may have a higher scenario or a lower scenario. If you say that there is a given range of so much, it's not clear what would be the role of policies in this predefined uncertainty range. So that is where, particularly for when we have these complex policy mechanisms, also in the context of climate change, I personally came to the conclusion that it's more straightforward to deal with scenarios where you clearly can identify what assumptions flow into this. And then, of course, you can also merge them. You can have conditional probabilistic projections where you have a scenario variable in one dimension and otherwise, let's say, future migration or future mortality is indeterminate, and there you have a probability range. So it's a choice of the producer and what the consumers will want.
Thank you. Wolfgang, I have a question. I fully agree with you that the simplistic link from income towards fertility doesn't work. What we're doing now in the SSPs, we do kind of a loose handshake of do the scenarios make sense and are they mutually consistent? But do you see any low-hanging fruit on how we can improve this feedback link from the economic projections to the population projections?
Well, this is a very good question. First of all, there was a low-hanging fruit because the one determinant of fertility and for mortality also that is very obvious in all countries and all societies, education, fertility and the education mortality. So we have endogenized this by having education explicitly as an additional dimension. For the effect of income, it really depends on the setting and whether you are already still in the early stage of demographic transition or the center or the low. So there is less. Just to give you the example, economists typically think of a positive income effect. If you are richer, you can afford more children and you will have more. And you see this in many Arab states. The sheikhs have many more. The rich guys have more children. But then, of course, with income also comes a value change. There comes a change in preferences. It also goes along with education that you prefer quality of children to quantity of children. And this is very difficult to model quantitatively. So, that's why we have a mixed approach where we have hardwired, so to say, in the population SSPs, the education effect, but it does not determine everything. You then have different scenarios where a given education-specific fertility will either be higher or lower under different scenarios. So it's a mix of both.
Continue on this theme, Wolfgang, on the feedbacks. So we have one possible feedback from economics back to demographics. We have another feedback potentially from the environmental change back to demographics. Yesterday, some of the co-chairs of IPC also indicated that it's important to capture feedbacks. When would you think that we would be ready to potentially consider such feedbacks in the SSPs?
Well, that's again a very important question. We hope for some insights from this meeting here. Just 10 years ago, when we had our first big expert inquiry, we asked more than 850 experts about the arguments that would impact on future fertility, mortality, and migration levels. We had all kinds of drivers pre-specified and also environmental change, generally climate change, biodiversity. And for the fertility and for the mortality, virtually there was consensus that on top of the other social and economic determinants, it's unlikely to have a visible impact on fertility and mortality. Migration, they said 10 years ago, yes, there would be impact of climate change on migration, but mostly there would be internal migration and less international migration. So we tried to incorporate that to some extent. Now, Nguyen here, from the new leader of YASA's population program and working with the JRC before, is now conducting a new survey 10 years after the old one. Again, a big expert solicitation. I would expect that now more experts point at, because climate change is so much more prominent now than it was 10 years ago, that even the social scientists will have thought more about this, and I expect more explicit feedback, but how strong it will be and in what precise direction we have to wait and see.
Thank you very much both for the answer to the questions. Jonathan, is this quick?
I had a question about high-income convergence for fertility rates. Is that too much to ask right now?
No, let's do it quickly then.
I also had a question about quality of children. I have a 14-year-old, and sometimes I wonder. So if you have a measure,
quality of children, of course, are very dangerous and bad. It's economic slang. It's investing more in children in their education and their health versus just fatalistically taking as many children as God gives you. Now, the convergence is a big issue. There is a range between the lowest fertility we see now in Korea, 0.8, so it's even below 1. In the past, people didn't believe, the mothers didn't believe it could ever fall below 1 child per effort, and others are still close to 2. So somewhere in this range between, let's say, 1 and 2, with some extreme countries going outside, we will lie. Whether we will converge to 1.5, 1.7, or 1.2 is really quite unclear at the moment, and that's why we also need different scenarios for the longer run.
We will move now to the second presenter, who is Johannes Koch, and he will be presenting remotely. So we will first see the video, but after that there's the opportunity still to ask questions. So please start.
Welcome everyone. Today I have the pleasure of presenting a joint work by Marianne Lambach and myself with the title Update of SSP GDP Projections, Capturing Recent Changes in National Accounting, PPP Conversion and COVID-19 Impacts. Over the past years, after multiple calls for an update, the IAM and scenario community has agreed to update the SSP scenarios. But why is an update necessary? The fact of the matter is that the original SSP population and GDP projections are almost 10 years old. And while the population projections have been updated by the team at the Wittgenstein Center, the GDP projections have not. New data is now available and historic data has been revised. Also, a global pandemic has occurred and the next global crisis is brewing as a direct consequence of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. In light of these major disruptions of predictable trends, consistency of modeling results with the most recently available data has become more important than ever. Finally, we found that using the new scenarios can have a large impact on IAM results. If IAM results are highly sensitive to income or GDP data, then making sure that that data is the most accurate as possible is crucial. There are multiple ways that the SSP scenarios can be updated. In this work, we perform a Level 1 or Type 1 update, where the focus is on harmonizing the future projections with the most recent historic data and trends. A Level 2 update is planned by the community for this year, and when that is published, our proposed scenarios will become obsolete. The methods, however, will still be very relevant and applicable to future Type 1 updates that we at the Potsdam Institute will perform on a yearly basis. With our focus being the harmonization of the projections with the most recent historic data, the choice of data source was an important step. We compared all large databases with GDP data at purchasing power parity and evaluated them along different criteria, one of which, completeness, is shown here. As you can see, the World Bank's World Development Indicator database has the highest coverage for the recent past, and the International Monetary Fund's World Economic Outlook has the highest coverage for the near future. It is for this reason, and others, such as their renown, their update frequency, and their widespread use in the community, that we chose the WDI and WEO as our main data sources. Having picked our data sources, we were now able to create the updated scenarios. The first step was to make sure that the data from the databases and the SSP data were expressed in the same unit. One can either convert the database data into 2005 international dollars PPP, the unit of the original SSPs, or convert the SSP data into 2017 international dollars PPP, the unit in the current databases. The second option is not as straightforward as the first, as a simple conversion does not keep the long-term income levels in the same order, thereby changing the underlying SSP narratives, which was something we wanted to avoid. Once the conversion process was established, we then created the following harmonization procedure in line with the SSP narratives, especially that of income conversions, which is the assumption that by 2100, low-income and developing countries catch up to the income levels of countries at the frontier. Notice that the harmonization is done on the GDP per capita level, which apart from guaranteeing the consistency with the SSP narratives, also allowed us to make use of the Wittgenstein Center new population projections when computing the GDP projections. Here are some results. This is a plot comparing the updated SSP GDP per capita scenarios to the original ones for China and India. The left-hand side panels show the recent past and near future, while the right-hand panels cover the entire time span of the scenarios. Looking at the right-hand side, you can clearly see that in the long run, updated and original scenarios are the same, which is by construction. Looking at the left-hand side, however, you can see a clear difference between the updated and original scenarios. Notice that in the updated scenarios, all SSPs followed the same path until 2026, the last year of the IMF projections, before splitting off and converging to their respective 2100 values. Notice also the clear impact of the COVID pandemic on growth rates between 2019 and 2020, specifically in India. The growth rates are given explicitly in this table. As you can see, India's pre-pandemic yearly average was approximately 5%, while in 2020 it was almost minus 9%. And in fact, when looking at the top 10 most affected countries by the pandemic, you can see that India is third, suffering a drop of 13, almost 14 percentage points. China, on the other hand, is one of the rare countries that managed to keep a positive growth rate during the pandemic. Here are some further results. These are the same plots as before, but this time for Tanzania and the US. Here again, we can see large differences in the left-hand panels between updated and original scenarios. As for the COVID shock, the US saw a sharp decline in 2020, but is predicted to rebound straight away. As we can see in the table, very high growth rates are predicted by the IMF for the US in the year 2021 and 2022, 5% roughly, before coming back down to a pre-pandemic-like growth rate of 1.33 in 2025. The same rebound effect is now projected for Tanzania. While the initial shock in 2020 isn't as large as for the other countries, the recovery is very slow. So slow that even in 2025, growth rates are still below the pre-pandemic average. I hope that these slides made it clear in what way the updated scenarios include data on the COVID shock and projected recovery. This feature of the scenarios was highlighted as the consistency of the scenarios with the effects of the pandemic is something that modeling teams demand and that stakeholders expect to see in IAM results. One other feature of the updated scenarios that may have caught your attention is the large difference to the original scenarios in the starting years 2010 and 2015. Where does this come from? 2010 was a data point when the original scenarios were constructed, and 2015 lay in the near future. Were the projections so far off? This difference in income between the updated and original scenarios is computed here in relative terms. As intuited by looking at the plots, the relative differences are, for a lot of countries, very large. 30% for India, 45% for Tanzania even. And these large differences aren't restricted to single countries. In the lower part of the table are shown the differences for world regions. The MEA region, which is Middle East and Africa, sees a 57% increase. Only REF, which includes Russia and other ex-Soviet Union countries, has a downward correction. Globally, the 2015 GDP per capita value is 13.5% higher in the updated scenario than in the original. Why? This graph sheds some light on the issue. Plotted here are GDP per capita from different databases and different publishing years, but in the same unit. In solid lines are GDP per capita published in 2020, and in dotted lines, GDP per capita published in 2012. Across world regions and across databases, the GDP per capita values published in 2020 are higher than the values published in 2012. It seems that an extensive revision of past data took place between 2012 and 2020, leading to higher values in historic years when accessing data today. And this is indeed what happened. Between 2012 and 2020, countries across the globe implemented a new system of national accounts, the SNA 2008, named that way because the United Nations actually passed it in 2008, but it was only later that the countries implemented it. The adoption of a new system of national accounts simply means that GDP is now accounted for in a different way than before. One change that had a large impact was the reclassifying of R&D purchases as investments instead of intermediate goods, which are not accounted into GDP. Also, countries took the opportunity of the change of SNA to implement statistical benchmark revisions, which are simply improvements to the methods or data sources used in GDP computation. For some countries, these statistical benchmark revisions had a larger effect on GDP than the switch of SNAs. Finally, and this affects only GDP at purchasing power parity, the better the unit we are dealing with, a new international comparison program report was published in 2020, giving us new PPP estimates for the reference year 2017. This in turn leads to revisions of PPP time series in databases, which are the result of inter- and extrapolation exercises between the PPPs of given reference years of recent ICP reports. That means that the PPP in 2005 can be changed to a more or lesser degree after a new ICP publication. This concludes the analysis of the scenarios. So for the last two slides, I would like to show you what a change of income scenarios from the original to the updated can have for an effect on IAM results. In order to get a feel for what a change to the updated scenarios may have for an impact on IAM results, we decided to take the oldest of IAMs, Nordhaus's dice, which is still widely used today for exactly such experimental first-look analyses, and test the switch of SSP scenarios. There's no time to dive into all the workings of DICE here, but suffice to say that income scenarios are used in DICE to calibrate the total factor productivity parameter in the production function. What we did therefore was that we calibrated DICE to the original SSP2 scenario, then to the updated scenario, and compared the results. The results of the exercise are shown here. In this table are shown major driving and outcome variables for DICE in the years 2015 and 2030 for both calibration runs and the relative change from one to the other. What we see is that calibrating DICE to the updated SSP2 income data leads to a 30% increase of the social cost of carbon in 2015 and 2030. This is a massive difference and one that has a large implication for policymakers. The size of the impact is in line with what Nordhaus finds himself when comparing DICE versions over time, and he even concludes that the major revisions have come primarily from economic aspects of the model, and that the economic projections are the least precise parts of IAMs and deserve much greater study than has been the case up to now. Given Nordhaus's findings, and given the obvious sensitivity of the IAM results to income data, the least we can do is make sure that we use the most accurate data possible. So to conclude, what I presented here today was a level 1 type update of the SSP, GDP, and income scenarios that preserve the SSP narratives, yet take recent changes of GDP accounting methods and PPP conversion factors into account, and include the 2020 COVID shock and the recovery thereafter. The methods used in the creation of the scenarios are applicable to future Type 1 updates, which will be required and necessary, hopefully done on a yearly basis. We also saw, with the admittedly very short and quick example of DICE, that updating income and GDP data can have a very large impact on IAM results. Thank you for your attention.
Hi everyone. Hi. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last thing that was just said after the presentation. I think the audio wasn't connected yet.
No, so I was just indicating that to the room that if there are questions, they can ask them now, because you would be online.
Yes. Yeah, I'm glad to take any questions if there are any.
Yeah. Do them first. Can you hear?
We're doing that. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah. Johannes, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. And I was especially wondering, also on your last slide, you referred to processes of updating the GDP growth projections, and especially the fact that you used also the IMF projections going out to 2026, and those have greatly changed, of course, with individual, almost now 4 times a year kind of COVID-19 re-estimates of IMF growth projections, but also more generally, we often see that IMF tends to be a little bit on the more optimistic side compared to World Bank GDP growth projections. So what is your kind of vision for thinking about, updating that going forward? Also looking back and seeing that there have been quite some revisions of those estimates.
Yeah, thank you. I realize that these projections are updated frequently, and our only solution is to once a year use the latest data and then revise the projections accordingly. And comparing the IMF projections, the World Bank projections, which ones are more optimistic or not, we actually haven't gone into depth into that, and maybe that's something we should look into, if it is as you say. Otherwise it's using the most recent projections and then running with those.
Thanks. And maybe quickly also putting some thought on this. And so far we had the SSP GDP data at one single place, and as they were published originally. And I think individual teams did updates themselves, at least several teams did, and they still called it SSP2. And they were close enough to an SSP2 to be considered an SSP2. But if we are going to do this more as a community, we might also want to think how we want to version some of this. So we would have maybe versionings with some of these level 1 updates being versioned in a different way than the real updates that would occur when we redo the scenarios. So it might be good at some point to simply apply some to have some commission of people being in charge of the versioning of the different SSP data sets. Okay, I think I will move to the next presentation by Samir on updating SSP populations and human capital projections. So we now will see the first glimpse of the new demographic projections. Samir, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm glad that Wolfgang spoke before me, and also we saw some more thing about the updates and all. The SSP1 or the SSPs, the version 1 was I think January 2013 was when we provided that input, and I also have this last 2014 because then we had some small updates there, like maybe type 1 type of update. But 2013 January is the official SSPs, and we had this kind of population structures that with the S there, with the age, gender, and education as our population. And there were, I think at that time, 197 countries, so we had to project this kind of graph, or this kind of pyramids. I would also say that those small boxes of people that we put here to project into the future. And like this is SSP2 for Asia, just picking from what we did in 2013. So just this, there will be more of this kind of graphs here. So you would see that the males are on one side, females are on the other, and then we have the A's from bottom to up, and then we have the colors representing different levels of education. Red is the no education group, and then the blue are the tertiary educated groups. And in terms of the dimensions, we have country, age, sex, education as here. So in order to project this, population, the transitions that is happening here are that mortality, people are dying, there are international migration, and then new members of the population are created by fertility. On top of that, we have the education component, which is like, then we also need the education transitions, right? Like there are different levels of education. So this additional level of transitions were added here. And very briefly, how we came up with this SSP projections is that the first step was like this SSP narratives that was being developed. we converted those SSP narratives into the demographic and education scenario. There was many meetings in the SSP community we are having. So first it was a qualitative conversion of the narratives, and then we had to operationalize it. And at that time we were working on this big volume that Wolfgang was the bit work, projection work that Wolfgang presented earlier. Basically, the qualitative variance of fertility, mortality, migration, and education was converted by based on those exercise, and at the end the projection was done. So in just very quickly, there were 500 plus online experts input. There were 6 meetings all over the world done for different components of our model. Forces of changes were identified, and then we had set like a long-term projection until 2100 and questions like what would be the final the fertility level that the world will stabilize. That kind of questions were gathered from those meta experts. And then when we are thinking about collecting the information, we are also asking questions about the medium term, short term, and when talk about medium term is 2050 and short term was 2030. So after that projection, then in 2018, we also updated, because 5 years for us is a long time. Not so long time, but still like lots of data, new data would be coming there. So we did update it. Some SSP community people use this data, but we were not. It was not yet included in the official SSPs. And some of the changes that we made there was changing the baseline from 2010 to 2015, adding more countries with population and especially the education details. Michaela is there, and that's talking about the education details. And earlier we had these 3 country groupings where we had high fertility group, and then we have in the low fertility we have this rich OECD and the other ones. And so the assumptions that we are making for this rich OECD and other low fertility countries were a little bit inconsistent, that we are getting this input that you cannot assume that for both having low fertility but being rich, you will have a different one. So we decided to just have low and high fertility countries. So our assumptions, we started making assumptions for the SSPs in these 2 groups. And so this was there, and in September last year, the SSP committee asked us, so we had to stop all our work and then put everybody together to, and the target was given actually March end. It was impossible target that now we know. So we managed to put our team together. There were 10 plus people there working on different dimensions. We tried to bring the baseline to 2020, but in many cases the data was still not available. And then we saw that like why to update, yeah. So we saw that in many areas the fertility went below the expected ones that we were expecting in our first SSPs. But then new data were coming out from the UN, and we also saw that positive news about improvement in mortality rates, HIV/AIDS, and under 5 mortality children rates. That was actually we are getting more survival there. So the age structure was a bit different than what we were expecting there. And also in some cases, we also saw slowdown in life expectancy, especially again at the older ages. And then we have the Syrian and Ukraine crisis, the COVID, and so all those things that we saw in the last 10 years made us, these are the enough reasons for us to do the update. And this is ongoing work. So I will just go quickly through the updates, what we did. So in case of the structure, we have, at that time when we had the first SSPs there, it was the UN World Population Prospect of 2010. So there's mostly information from before 2010. So now the latest available is 2019, and soon there will be 2022 coming in, maybe next month. So we will have to do some checking there if there is some age structures with some new data that we haven't yet got we might have to do that. And then we also managed to gather education distribution, or the new education distribution in 30 plus countries. So we are also doing the nowcasting of the education distribution to project into the future. So this is about the baseline structure. For mortality, we have new life tables compared to 2010. So we rerun the model with the new data for the future life expectancy projection, life expectancy and birth projection. We spent quite a time investigating on the COVID impact. We thought that will not be so difficult, but at the end, we had to different sources are coming out about how the COVID has made the loss in gain in life expectancy at birth. Yeah? So there is an expectation that the gain, that all the countries are gaining the life expectancy in the future, but COVID came and it made that dent there. And the question about how to include that was a big one, and we managed to get some data, like when publications are still coming out. And then here was also one question about what do you think will happen? Will all the loss in life expectancy, will it be regained? And the life expectancy trajectory will just start coming to the what we were expecting before COVID. So this was a question, and at the moment we are, for example, taking this value of 70%, saying that only the 70% of the loss in life expectancy will be gained, because of this long COVID, and we don't know what the next variant might come. Maybe now it has to change. But we had to bring this kind of assumptions there, and this is just here to share. And for the age specific, so normally when we play with the life expectancy levels, there is like a model life tables, and how the increase in a life expectancy will be impacting all the ages. But in case of COVID, it was very unique, and it was only impacting certain age groups. Like for example, this is a graph from CDC US, like how the COVID proportion of deaths happening in different, it's actually the excess deaths, okay? So if you see, this is the zero line, so anything up there is like the excess deaths happening in that particular age group. For example, in the age group of 60, there were almost 30% excess deaths happening. So COVID was impacting differently, and also by gender it was impacting differently. So we tried to gather this data mostly from the US at the moment, so we are applying that here. But we will see if we can get more data. I think we have some data already, but they haven't included it. So we will be correcting the mortality with COVID like this. And then we also had this the education differential in mortality. So there are more now based on the data. So I will go quickly through this. Just to mention this last point that I put here is that, so in some cases we have under 5 mortality by mother's education. In some cases we only have the adult mortality by their own education. At the moment we kind of took it as a proxy to each other. So under 5 differential, under 5 mortality was used for the adult, and adult mortality differential was under 5 mortality. So this has to be, all of this has to be thoroughly reviewed, rechecked, but this is what it is now. And for fertility, basically, we updated with the most recent data. We don't have a very specific COVID impact yet, but the 2020 values for some countries, TFR values were being included here. So we assume that some of those impact of COVID, if any, there was some impact, some minimum impact there was included here. And finally, the migration component. So in the migration component, earlier we were using the information about, before 2010, like how the migration was happening in the world. And this time we have the migration information from the UN, based on the UN stock data, UNSD 2002, where each country, you will know how many people are there who are born in the other part of the world. So they have this 5-yearly data which was used by our colleagues. to estimate the flows by sex, by gender, and then using the IPUMS data. This is the international public use micro census data or micro sample data. So you have lots of micro data there, which was then used to estimate the education differential in migration flows. And the random forest model was used, and later this standard Rosetta schedule were used. So these are the methods, and I don't know how many minutes I have. Okay. So I'll just go through the results, and this is all preliminary, and if you see anything odd, just let me know. But basically, big news for me is that if you see that this is the line of SSP2 from 2013. Yeah, sorry for this, I hope you see. And the other 5 points, SSP1 and SSP5 are all here. But this is SSP2 from 2000, the first SSP, and this is our new SSP. So it looks like we will have, in our SSP2, we'll have a bit higher population peak around below 10 billion. The population will be peaking around below 10 billion. And then the other SSPs, I should have put the other SSPs here from the older one. Sorry for that. But then the SSPs, basically others, SSP1 and 5 are almost identical. And then we have the SSP4 and SSP5 like in the usual places. And I also put for reference the UN projection here from the WPP 2019, and SSP4 is quite close to the UN projection. So this on the side, here we have the population further disaggregated by education, and so here it's the under 15 years old, so they are children. So you see that the world's population, there will be the size of the children number of children will decline in the future, right? So there is in the SSP2 scenario. So it's mostly the adult population, and we see that this 15+ population, this colored one, there will be more, it will be larger, but more educated population. So a few more graphs for just the results. This is SSP2, male, female, again, those pyramids. And this time you will see the rates one on the outside. So this is the big change between the two SSPs. Now I put the red colors on the outside. Basically, the population of the younger cohorts will keep on declining, and this is how we would see the world in 2100. We see lots of aging population, but also with higher level of education. This is a graph where to show all the 5 SSPs. I managed to run yesterday at 12 o'clock. We are working with Rob, providing this input to Rob, so he actually have a little bit different person than this one. Yeah? But this is like but the big story at the national global level is will not change. And basically we have the SSP2 world, SSP1 and SSP5 world are almost identical. With lower population peaks, higher levels of education. You check this number of children. Yeah, the fertility is really driving their very. So I'm actually even thinking maybe I should check that. But we have this SSP3 where constant enrollment, the education is kind of stalled, and everything bad that could happen from demographic sense is happening here. But then we also have this SSP4, which is this inequality kind of world. So even within a country there are some unequal development. So yeah, and then I have some other graphs to show that how different countries are behaving there. Nigeria, India, France, there with different distributions. But there are also countries like Japan and China going down in all SSPs. There was one or two other little bit odd graphs which I deleted here, but I have to go and check it back. Yeah. There's some Russia Federation, Russia is there, and so finally the conclusion here, or what really not a conclusion, but it's that we managed to set up things, and we know that we have already identified few issues here and there, and we know what to do. So in the next days and coming months, we will be refining this, and yeah. So basically, we are waiting for, we might include this UN, so whenever the UN WPP 2022 will come, we'll have a check, like how is it there, and COVID, and then Ukraine is not yet included in our model, but independently we are working on the Ukraine model as well. So we'll see, like if something solid is coming there, something important is coming there, we will also bring them in. Thank you.
So we have been running a little bit over time, but I don't think that's a problem. We have a lot of discussion time at the end still. Any questions with respect to the updates and the new results? And they're really fresh, calculated last night. Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Samir. Really interesting presentation. I was wondering about the differences between SSP3 and SSP4 in terms of education, and especially upper education, because in SSP3, which is the regional rivalry, the upper education seems to be less than in the inequality scenario, which is SSP4. So I was wondering, what are the assumptions behind in the inequality scenario? How because upper education is increasing, but inequality is also increasing. So how is that relationship?
I can, yeah, thanks. I answered it. So I think if just to put it like on the table, like what was there, right? So in the SSP3 was considered a bad scenario for development, and there we assumed our constant enrollment rate scenario. So that means all the enrollment rates of 2015, say, will be stalled. So all the cohorts will receive that. Yeah? But in terms of SSP4 as an input, what we have defined here is this is an inequality world, where within a country there will be the global education trend scenario. That is what we have it for the SSP2, like a trend scenario. The trend scenario will continue for some education groups. I think it's mostly going into the secondary and tertiary. But those who are in the lower education groups, there is actually even worse than the constant enrollment rate scenario. So where it's actually certain areas, or maybe the elite areas or the urban areas, and depending on which country you talk, there will be the education trend will continue, but then within the country, there will be even the worse than the education. So this was coming out of as I said, these iterative meetings that we were having, and this is how we defined. Yeah. But if Wolfgang, you want to add anything more to that, I think that's how we defined the SSP4 as a unequal world, and within the country, bring some difference there.
Hi, Samir. Thank you. I was wondering, I had a few questions about the expert-based population projection or surveys, and how does that work concretely? Like, does an expert is going to say, oh, I think fertility is going to go down to here? Are they like are they doing these assumptions because they're from a country that they know, and they know, I don't know, the circumstance there? So for me, it's like a bit of a mystery how it happens. So that's one question. And then to your opinion, what's the added value? So what does the expert can say that the data cannot say? And the third question is this expert-based survey also part of the updates somehow or not?
I can answer all of those questions, but I think Wolfgang is already there, so you can say something and I will add to it if something is said. Yeah.
Well, since I was designing this 10 years ago exercise, maybe I can answer. So your last question, what can experts know more than the data? The data only go for the past up to the present. We have no data for the future. But experts are observing the trends, and they are observing other changes in policies and determinants in their country, so that the experts have to choose for which country they are experts. and also whether they're fertility, mortality, and migration experts. So they need to have a track record. The question is, who's an expert? Typically, the definition is if you have worked at least 10 years on one topic, then you are considered an expert. Now, the question is, how are these operationalized? I said, this is not just a Delphi asking you what do you think is going to be the fertility rate in India in 2030 or so, but we have predefined forces in terms of how different drivers of fertility, from reproductive health and family planning to female education to whatever, different conditions. And then they have to assess, based on the literature they know, how valid these arguments they are. For instance, that in public health, sort of that the infectious diseases may see an uprise again. Actually, this was one of the things that was before COVID. We thought that we are not yet done with infectious diseases, may come back, and then what is the probability of this happening, and how would it impact on future life expectancy. So these expert arguments, we had done a scoring scheme, and this was sort of translated into what the experts think, that the fertility would either be moderately declining or rapidly declining due to these reasons. And then we blended this. Actually, we had sort of three levels of input. The one was a statistical modeling, that sort of trend extrapolation, quite similar to what the UN does, data-driven, if nothing changes. Then we blended this, weighted with whatever the expert argument score coming out, and then there were these meta-experts. They're actually sort of globally leading experts on fertility, mortality, and migration coming together and reviewing the whole thing and having sort of a bird's eye view. So these were the three inputs that then resulted in one number.
I can add to that is that for some countries we have no expert input, and that would be purely UN type, model. But for those countries where we have expert opinions or input, like in terms of the TFR, even like was collected from the website, we would bring that in. So there's like the blending it with that. Yeah. And in the future, the next update, which Anne was mentioning earlier in the other session, that there will be this expert kind of meeting and expert kind of survey in the future that JRC might do this, and there will be this kind of questions there. Yeah. So it will be an update. So that's why we call it just an update and not a revision. Yeah. So the long-term things are kept the same, only from the short-term changes we have added. Update.
Are there further questions? There are two more. I think it's fine to run a bit over on this part because we have this discussion later, and it's probably better to do it now. Yeah, so let's start here, then you next. Yeah, one thing that I forgot to say, but it might be nice actually if people introduce themselves before asking a question, so that we as a community get to know each other better as well.
I'm Lei Wenjiang, with the Population Council and Asian Demography Research Institute at Shanghai University. First a comment, a question, and the comment just say for the experts' opinion, who was chosen as experts for Mexico? Because if you look at the mortality, and the current mortality rate of Mexico is lower than much significantly lower than the SSP3 assumption, and a lot of one on international migration. The international migration is also much lower than SSP3. And so that's the recent trend. Since the expert's opinion was totally wrong, that's a comment. And for question, you use the APOMS data to derive the migration flows. I think that's international migration, in and out, right? What kind of migration rate numbers are you use? Do you use a net number or use a rate, or what has been used? And given the recent changes in international migration flows, that APOMS data can correctly reflect on the recent the changes. For instance, and in the U.S., in Mexico, and in Europe, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah. So I think the first question about this migration, the expert opinion and how the expert input in the assumptions. So we have to check like how much of the Mexico's or particular countries assumption is based on what proportion is based on the experts. So we can check that. And as I said, I don't know which SSPs you are using, which version. If this is the first one, so it was based on before 2010. 16. Okay. So this is based on the I think UN data before. I think it's from 2015 or 17. I'm not sure. So the guy above did that, right? And for the question about the education migration, so this is our new thing in our model. So there, first we had the overall flows that is coming from the UN. So 2020, the stock data. So that is the most recent data that we could get hand on. And the education distributions, the education differentials were actually put on top of that. So maintaining the overall flows between the countries from the UN, the most recent UN data, the education distributions were as proportionally kind of put there. So this is done by Dilek. So he's not here to tell you more about that, but we try to maintain the main source of flows that is from the 2020 data. But this point, just to say that we will have this kind of this thorough review that what I mentioned is we have not yet done. So we are just starting to do that, and then we'll be happy to have you help us on going through countries, or we can think of how to share the first set.
Thank you for all this very interesting discussion. So I'm Lionel Fontanier, Banque de France, so the central bank, CEPI in Paris and Paris School of Economics. So I just want to rebound on Wolfgang's response. And this is about semantic, and I think that semantic is important when it comes to presenting what we are all doing to policymakers. And so I just want to discuss the word trend that has been used repeatedly this afternoon, and just to figure out what it means exactly. Because when it comes to discussing with a policymaker, if you speak of a trend, he or she is just figuring out that you are drawing the line, so you observe the past growth rate and you are drawing the line. And so this is not exactly what we have in mind when we are speaking of trend. Let's take fertility. I'm not a demographer at all, I'm an economist, but let's take fertility. So if you can, in the data, figure out that fertility is a function of education, female education, of income per capita, regional specificities, whatever. So since you know what is the catching up in terms of education, if you think of the catching up in terms of income per capita and all the rest, you can project very easily with all these data at hand what will be the future fertility rate in the different regions, in the different countries in the world. And so, to me, this is a trend. I would just like to check with you whether this is a trend or not, or whether using the trend is just drawing the line. And so this comes to the question of the role of experts. So the role of experts might be to tell us, well, you have these elasticities, let's say, in your econometric models. And so what you don't see is that for certain reasons like religion, etc., you will have behavioral changes, and this is not in your elasticities. And so we are present just to tell you that your elasticities are wrong, have to be reconsidered just for this. So could you elaborate a bit on what a trend means?
Thank you. I think I understand what trend means. Like when I was studying statistics, right? So anything that has time and then how things are. I think in our case, we also have this total fertility rate, for example, right? The fertility rates from the past, and if it's just one country, we can fit a time series and extend the train in that way. And we know, well, actually in this way, because fertility is mostly coming down, and we know that even though sometimes you look at fertility, it could be a straight line coming down, but we know that this will not happen, so we have to bring on some kind of a floor there, and there could be even the rebound and all. And this is mostly then informed by what is experienced in other countries, so we have already experienced that in the past. So this is a common way of projecting the trend into the future, that you can have your like a single trend being projected, but you can also say what will be the next value that will come would be based on the global trend, meaning how the other countries who have passed through that point have experienced. So this is like a normally done in our case. I guess we can call it a trend. Yeah, and then the experts would come there and say, well, here it could not be so low, or that. But so far, this is how we have been doing it, and there's like a common practice of doing it. Anything at Wolfgang or okay?
I think we move to the next presentation. Willem, if it's okay that we ask you after the presentation, we have a longer discussion session, so we'll come back to that. Yeah. So Rob Dellink of the OECD, responsible for creating the economic projections in the SSP last time, and now doing the updates as well, and receiving the data on demographics yesterday. So now the economic projections.
Exactly, Detlef. So I'm going to make your life as a chair very hard, because I didn't have time to cut down my presentation, so I have way too many slides. So I'm relying on your yellow and red cards. But actually it is an easy job for me here, because first of all, Samir already introduced half of my input data, because they come from him, and that's something that we got yesterday, and then we ran our model yesterday, and now I'm as eager as you, basically, to see the results. That's not entirely true, but this is very fresh off the press. So please, this is more proof of concept than semi-final results or anything like that. Sorry. So this is work joint with a number of colleagues at the OECD. I also want to thank Johannes, who's on the call, because Johannes already presented some of the ideas of how you do updates of PPPs over time and the kind of problems you get. And we do basically exactly what he did in his paper, we do in our modeling as well, except that we update to the 2017 PPPs rather than backcasting to the 2005 PPPs. But it is based on the same idea of updating. So I'm not going to tell you too much about what the SSPs are. You should know by now, and otherwise you might leave the room. So the background is basically that we have these developments in demographics. The one thing that I always stress is that 10 years ago we were still in this idea that globalization, global value chains were increasing part of the world economy, and more international trade. And international trade was basically a driving force of economic growth. And after 2015, we've not seen that happen so much. Since 2015, trade has been much less of an engine of growth than it was before. Also, in 2016, there was a major resource commodity price collapse, and that led to growth rates in sub-Saharan Africa basically collapsing to roughly 0%. And that was then a very major shock compared to what we had expected in the SSPs, because the SSPs did not expect that shock. And then more recently, at COVID-19 and Ukraine war as major shocks. So the idea is to go to step 2. Johannes presented step 1, which is you use the new data and then you somehow try to figure out how the storylines then affect the long-term trends. And what we're doing here is we're rerunning the model. We fill in the new data, we do the latest expectations of what the experts expect on the drivers of growth, etc., and then we recalculate what happens to GDP at the country basis. So I'm not going to say so much about the SSPs and the differences in the SSPs, but basically the SSP2 is this intermediate economic growth. Then you have on the left-hand side low challenges for adaptations, kind of translating into higher economic growth, and higher challenges for adaptation translating into lower economic growth. So basically SSP 3 and 4 are the low economic growth, and SSP 1 and especially SSP 5 are the high economic growth scenarios. So our model is a model of what we call conditional convergence. This is the idea that as an economy progresses over time, you have a sort of technology frontier that you're aiming towards, and this technology frontier is every year you're coming closer to that. You're getting better basically at producing the stuff that you're already producing, but at the same time, you have a long-term frontier itself that grows because, for example, you're learning from technology developments in China, in Korea, in the US, etc. So you're catching up to where you can be that year, but the place where you're catching up to is also moving over time. And these things move on the basis of how exposed you are to international trade, some country-specific effects, but also the ease with which you can update your production factors, etc., through regulations. And secondly, we have investment flows and depreciation that then drive physical capital growth. We have labor, and this is where exactly the demographic projections enter in. So we split labor. Basically, look at effective labor, which is a combination of the human capital, basically how much one person can produce in terms of his skills and his stuff like that. So that depends on the education and the age structure as provided by Samir, and then the pure labor force, the employment levels, which relate on population, but also participation rates and unemployment rates. And each of these dark green ones are endogenous rules that we have in the model, so they are updated every year based on how we project our model, and then the lighter green are the exogenous factors. So we have basically an exogenous depreciation rate every year. 5% of your capital stock depreciates, but we have endogenous investment, which depends on your capital accumulation and on your GDP level, etc. We have a bit of energy demand in there, although I have to say in this current version it basically plays no role, so I'm not going to talk about that. But the final part is that for a number of countries, take the extreme example of Qatar. Qatar has a per capita income of around $70,000, $80,000, and that doesn't come because they have a very high labor productivity. That comes because they sell a lot of oil. So in order to make a projection of how the development of GDP in Qatar has to be, you have to look at what happens to their rents that they get from the natural resources, from the oil and gas. So basically we have a separate module to then calculate the export revenues from oil and gas, and that then drives a kind of what we call the natural resource value added, that is then part of your total GDP. So this basic idea is that if you are a country that is at the frontier, say US, potentially if you look at technology, it's also Korea, you are growing fairly steadily because you're learning over time to do things better, but you don't have a catch-up effect. If you're an emerging economy, the red line here, if you're an emerging economy, you're already catching up very quickly, so you're rapidly building up your investments, your capital stock, and that allows you to catch up to the frontier country. Whereas if you're a developing economy, you still are far behind, you have a fairly low capital stock, and you're far behind your frontier, so you're gradually ramping up your economic growth rate until you hit some sort of peak, and then gradually it fades away again. So this is kind of the standard idea of how countries in different stages of development are growing over time. I'm going to skip this. We have a number of formulas to calculate this technology frontier, but I don't have time for that, I think. So what we're doing in terms of data, well, we currently have 178 countries in the data set that we shared with Samir. I think Samir has more countries in his population. I think we have more countries in our economic data, but this is the overlap we have so far. And there's a number of countries that we just have some missing data and that we need to sort out. One typical example, Sudan split into Sudan and South Sudan. So if you base your model on historical trends and historical data, you have no data for South Sudan, and you get problematic effects for the Sudan because it suddenly is this much smaller country. So those types of countries are, in this version that I'm presenting today, they're just kicked out, and we need to sort this out and properly reintegrate them. So in the end, we hope to have more than 2,000 countries. We're now a little bit less, 200, sorry. Well, getting closer and closer. So YAFA's SSP-specific population education, labor market data from ILO and OECD, the short-term forecasts we use from the OECD Economic Outlook and the IMF. We are using the ones from the fall in 2021 because the spring ones from this year, we were made just at kind of the beginning of the Ukraine war, and short-term forecasts, in my experience, are always much less reliable when you're in the middle of a major shock. You have to wait and give these people a few months to figure out what is actually going on, and after a few months you get much more robust projections. So what we're actually doing is we're ignoring the spring 2022 update, but we intend to update to the fall 2022 short-term forecasts. Now, energy data come from the IEA. We use fairly up-to-date energy prices, but actually the oil rents and the gas rents that we're using are still from 2013, so that's production costs, and I think we have to work with the SSP, the integrated assessment models, to update these and get better data. Although the last time I checked together with some people from Message, I think it was, they're actually not that bad, and we're not doing that bad over time. But still, it's something that we need to update. So then the long-term baseline projection, we have a number of underlying drivers in our model, and these mostly come from our own OECD long-term projection model, but that's only for a select number of countries. That's basically OECD countries and a number of emerging economies. But together, these do add up to a large share of global GDP. And so for those, we have a very detailed set of drivers, and then what we do is for all the countries that are not in that data set, we have a kind of a simplified module to then calculate very similar convergence trends as what we find in the OECD countries and the emerging economies. So we're doing basically convergence, very slow convergence of the underlying drivers towards global averages or region-specific averages, etc., and that then generates the long-term projection. So how does this work then comparing the original SSPs with the new results? First is what Johannes very clearly explained. You have an update in the purchasing power parities. This matters hugely for the level of GDP at the global level, plus new GDPs, new PPPs generally mean higher weights to emerging economies and lower weights to developed economies. And so it's not only a scale up, basically, of your GDP level, it's also a different composition in the weight of the different economies in your global GDP. So that alone already affects your world GDP projection over time. But it also affects the 2015 levels and then the 2100 levels. Then we can add the effects of the 2012 to 2021 and 22 new data and the new forecasts to 2025 from the IMF and OECD that we're including. And the new data until 2015, surprisingly, there was already a little bit of effect. So basically in 2012, when we made the SSP projection, we were not able to exactly replicate the data that was there for 2015, but of course the effect is very small. But if you look at the long term, there has been the COVID shock, etc., and these things have a long-term effect. So the long-term level of GDP already in 2100 is already lower because of using the latest data that we have. And then we have the additional effect of the updated drivers, the latest understanding of how things converge, etc., market openness, all these effects. And that doesn't play any role in 2015, but it does already play a role in 2100. So basically, without changing any of the SSP-specific drivers, we already have a little bit lower growth in SSP2 than we had in the past. So to reflect the short-term effect here, so on the left, the original projection, on the right, the projection, the latest data, and the latest forecast that we have, clearly COVID shock is very visible. What's less visible here is that we have actually recurring low-income group has a growth rate that is actually above 6% for 2018 and 19. If you would extrapolate sub-Saharan Africa from that, it's much lower. So there has been clearly an effect in Africa that was not there in other low-income countries that has substantial effects in African countries. So then to the long term, and the long-term effects look fairly similar. If you look at these two, and if I show you one first and then the other one, and don't compare them side by side, you might think nothing changed. But there has been some trends, differences, and to my kind of surprise, the biggest difference is actually in the upper middle income countries. And that's basically where the emerging economies are. That's where the most volatility is on China. China, we currently don't have the same optimistic forecast for Chinese growth that we had 10 years ago. 10 years ago, everybody thought China is going to continue to boom for quite a long time. And now we see a lower growth rate to start with and also a more rapid reduction. But in terms of growth rates, this is not that bad in the long run. But then in terms of levels, you do see that the new update is therefore lower than when you just take the original SSPs and do the rescaling effect that Johannes talked about earlier. So for high-income countries, these are fairly stable countries. It's not so surprising that the SSPs were not that far off in the long run for these countries. For the high-income non-OECD countries, those are the ones that are basically, most of them are fossil fuel exporters. So there has been a PPP effect there because oil prices didn't evolve in the same way as other prices. So there's been a kind of substantial effect of the SSPs. But also, the trend is more or less the same, but the level is quite different. Upper middle income countries, I already said, we have lower expectations, but also for lower middle income and low income countries. So here's all side by side. And we see that we basically have lower growth trends for the lower middle income countries and low income countries, so lower growth rates than we had in the past. And we're still figuring out where that comes from. Part of it is population, I think. Higher population means that you basically have a slightly lower per capita growth than you had before, because labor is then a larger part of your production function, so the effect of technology improvements is a little bit smaller. We also have to look at what happened to education trends. We haven't looked at that yet, but I think we also see a little bit difference in education trends. So very quickly on, didn't see a yellow flag yet, but no, I don't want one. SSP1, here's what's interesting. The SSP1 and SSP5, you'll see the same thing. In 2012 or so, when we make these projections, 2025 was already, the long-term future. It was already where we looked at, we're not into the realm of short-term forecast. This was really about differentiating between SSPs, and one SSP is much more optimistic than the other SSP, so SSP1 was more optimistic. Well, by now, 2025 is basically for us a fixed year. It's the short-term forecast. There's hardly any differentiation you can still do by 2025. So there's much less difference in 2025 across the SSPs, so that means that for the fast-growing SSPs, like SSP1, you get slower short-term growth. And then there's slightly, if you look at the yellow one, the low-income countries that are still catching up, you do see they start much lower, but they have a slightly prolonged effect of growth because they basically need more time to catch up, although the effect is fairly small. And we are in SSP1, we are more optimistic on upper middle income countries, and I'm not entirely sure what drove the old ones, but I tend to entrust the new ones a bit better. SSP3 is the low growth scenario, where basically we have now a little bit more growth in the short run because we're harmonizing now to the 2025 IMF and OECD forecasts. So then we have that, but then we have rapid reduction because we have higher growth rate in 2025, we have a more rapid reduction in growth. And then in the long run, we basically have a stable growth rate. We now have it at a little bit above 1.5% per year. I think that might be over-optimistic. I think we might want to do a revision of these assumptions. This is basically, let me explain again. We didn't change the SSP-specific assumptions. This is just the new data, the new long-term background driver information. We think we need to be more pessimistic in this scenario by changing the SSP-specific assumption in SSP3 here to be more in line with the narrative of SSP3. SSP4, kind of the same thing. We are starting more optimistic. Maybe we're a little bit too optimistic in the long run. And SSP5 is very similar to SSP1. So if you then compare that, so those, as I said, I show you the two after each other instead of next to each other. They look fairly similar. But if you look at the global growth rates, SSP2, we have a little bit lower, and we're ending up in more or less the same place. But if you look at the global rates in SSP1, you see that we are kind of more flat. We have lower growth in the long run, in the short run, but higher growth in the long run. Similar in SSP5, slower growth in the short run, but higher growth in the long run. Especially in SSP5, I think we're underestimating the kind of bump we see there for 2030, 2040, which is the catch-up effect that you would have in SSP5. And that's not happening there yet as I would have expected it, so we have to revisit that assumption. But SSP2, SSP3, and SSP4 seem to be fairly in line in terms of storylines with the original projections. So the next steps, we need to fill in data gaps. We need to interpolate some data. We need to extrapolate some missing data. We need to update the energy information. And then we want to update to the fall 22 OECD and IMF forecast. That's basically the very last step we'll do is just before we come out with these new projections, we'll make sure that they're aligned with the latest short-term forecasts. But also we need to compare the new projections across the SSPs and adjust parameters to fit the storylines along the lines that I just discussed with you. So then we need to do a validation process. In the meantime, we need economic models, integrated assessment models. We hope to have first results probably by end August, maybe early September. And then whoever wants to run their model and do a test run, I think you're welcome to. We need to discuss a little bit. And then we want feedback on what works, what doesn't work. We could have a Mexico in there that has results that we haven't spotted that they're off, but you run your model and you have a focus on Mexico and you see that Mexico is actually not covered well in our modeling. Give us the feedback and we'll have another look at Mexico. If you have almost 200 countries, you can't really look at them all in the same detail. And finally, I think there should be a webinar or something, an Iconics webinar potentially, to present more up-to-date results and then basically do a feedback session like, are these the types of modeling results that you can work with and that you find plausible? And the very final, I know you're pushing me almost away, but the very final remark I have is, given the uncertainties we have with COVID, with the Ukraine war, how we saw uncertainties in the short term, in our 2017 paper with the original results, we had a short section in there on the effects of short-term uncertainties on long-term levels of GDP. The uncertainties now are, I think, substantially larger than they were 10 years ago. So we will have to think about how we design scenarios, sub-SSPs, uncertainty bands, whatever we can come up with. But we do need to have some process to alert users to the uncertainties that are there in the short run and how they affect the long run. Thank you.
You can stay here. Let's run a few minutes over. I had two plannings of this session, but the new planning we had to end at 4, and so that's now. So let's run a few minutes over for the questions.
Just one thing that I was asked to share, otherwise I will forget. That the plenary session will happen at 6:15, and it will be 1 hour in the plenary session that we missed this morning. I just forgot.
Yeah, thanks. Any questions with respect to the economics? Jonathan, and we see 3 questions. Yeah.
I'm Jonathan at the University of Denver at the Party Center. Thanks for the great presentation and all the great work. Thanks to everyone who does this work. It's all super useful for us. We'd love to do early runs on this stuff. I had two questions. One is the very end you talked about the short-term effects on long-term outcomes. Do the short-term IMF growth rates that you're including affect the baseline assumptions of the model? And the reason I ask is because we're going through a period of crisis, and I think those IMF growth rates tend to be a bit optimistic for the out years after a crisis, assuming rebounds often. So I'm just curious to know if that's going to be some sort of like systemic positive bias for some countries. And then the other question was about some aspects of, so for example, you include employment and labor participation within the model. So aspects like how important is the labor portion of this, and how important would it be not to include things like informal economic activity for low-income countries? Would that significantly affect results from your perspective? And thanks again.
I'll try, but otherwise, just ask again.
Hi. My name is Michiel van Dijk from Wageningen Economic Research. I have a bit of a related question. So we are currently updating our model, CG model, with the better representation of the labor force. And I think in your conceptual model, you indicated that labor force participation and unemployment are key drivers of your projections. So I was curious because they're endogenously determined. What are the SSP-specific assumptions related to, say, unemployment and labor force participation? Because I guess in a low growth scenario, unemployment might be much higher than in a high growth scenario. So just a bit more detail on this would be nice. Thank you.
Björn Söder from Potsdam Institute. Two quick questions about the growth rates for the high income countries. So in the past years, a few people have argued that lower growth rates are the new normal, some linking it to secular stagnation. And now currently we have the situation with very high inflation rates, and maybe you can briefly reflect what that means for economic outlook for the high income countries.
So I have a similar question to circular economy. I'm wondering, is there any consideration for other metrics to reflect welfare and well-being?
All right. Let's take them in order. The IMF tends to be a bit over-optimistic on the short term, on the recovery rates. I don't know whether that's a systemic bias or whether that's kind of happens sometimes but doesn't happen always. That's exactly why we ignored the spring. I think they're over-optimistic when you're in the middle of a crisis. And when you're first confronted with a shock, government agencies tend to think no, the shock will not be too important. And then they realize the full extent, and then they say, yeah, but we'll do a lot of things, and then not every policy response, for example, for recovery actually happens. Think about the US and their Build Back Better policies that haven't been enacted. So yes, IMF, of course, has to make assumptions on what passes Congress and what happens in terms of policy responses. And sometimes they're over-optimistic, sometimes maybe they're too pessimistic. I wouldn't go as far as say that there's a systemic bias. But I think it is important that you're extrapolating away from being in the middle of a crisis towards a little bit more. There is an effect of the short-term forecasts on the long-term projections, but it's mostly in terms of levels. It's more in levels than in growth rates, especially in the very long run. The growth rates tend to be a little bit less influenced by it. But as I said, we want to do some scenario analysis or something to kind of highlight that role of the short-term forecasts. Good question on the informal economy. So what we're doing is we're projecting GDP, and that's all we're doing. This is not a major economic model where we try to we don't have sectors, we don't have anything like that in the model. So it's purely a GDP projection, and that's as far as we go. On the SSP-specific assumptions on labor force participation rates and unemployment rates, the unemployment rates are not differentiated because there's nothing in the storylines, at least there was nothing in the storylines, that basically says that people will want to have more free time in SSP1 and therefore they withdraw from the labor market. I was actually talking to Eric in the back there yesterday that if you would design a post-growth alternative version of a model, yes, then you would have a scenario where you say people actually withdraw from the labor market because they want to spend more time outside of the economy and doing things like painting and canoeing. But that is something that is not in these current SSPs. So we have the same unemployment rates in the model. The labor force participation rates are endogenous, so they are specific because they're age and education specific, so they rely directly on Samir's SSP-specific projections. So there are differences in labor force participation rates, but they're not huge. High income growth, is it too optimistic? Well, SSPs in the end, I'm not here to tell you what these growth rates should be. What I'm here is to provide you with a tool that as a community you're comfortable with. We had the same discussion 10 years ago. We made an SSP2. Detlef and K1 looked at me and said, that's too high, and we lowered it. That's how this process works. It works through a community feedback effect. Yeah, I'm stubborn, I know. We changed a little bit at least. So no, it is a community product, but of course we have our underlying drivers, we have our models that restrict how far you can go. You can't expect me to run a scenario that completely goes in the opposite direction. But we have room for changing assumptions if, as a community, people think that it's too optimistic or not in line with the narratives. And finally, on circular economy and welfare metrics, I think you're expecting too much of this tool because this is just GDP. We have other tools in-house where we do circular economy projections using sectoral economic activity, and those link much better, and then we can do welfare categories. There's no households in this model at all. If we're doing an extension into multiple sectors, you get interesting effects because then you get a differentiation between production growth and consumption growth. So basically you can get the effect that an economy can specialize in industrialization, and at the same time households can specialize in servitization, and you have trade patterns to then compensate for that and work that out. We don't have that in this model. This is a pure macro model. And finally, I forgot to say something about inflation, and the reason I didn't say anything is that I really don't know. I am considering myself sort of a macroeconomist, but my background is much more in microeconomics and macroeconomics. But we have an economics department that has this huge tool that has all the monetary side of the economy behind all these GDP projections. So we don't have that at global level. But for the OECD countries, the emerging economies, it is based on fiscal balances and monetary balances. And then what we do is we take that as a starting point also for our view on what happens in non-OECD countries. But we don't have inflation in the model.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, sorry for running over. I also let the speakers run over a bit in their talks, but I thought it was really important to simply hear to what they had to present. The process after this. So we had hoped to be reasonably final results at this conference and then make sure that we could share them and then have final results in autumn. I think it is still quite important to do this update in as quick as we can. I think we have to also think a little bit of other considerations. First of all, the time that the demographic team and the economic team have for this and the time they need to finalize it. It might be good if we can also organize a period where we have the data available on the web and different teams can have a look and provide comments back. And then this might be a little bit at odds with trying to finalize it also in time, but let's discuss within the people working on this what would be an optimal timeline. be aiming for ending it certainly by the end of this year, but let's see whether we can find a timeline which also allows the review by the community, because I think it is really important, and I think some of the comments we heard today already alluding to that. At this point of time, I would like to close the session and thank the speakers again for their great presentations.